Chapter 43. Alden left a Lepta farm carrying only the few things he had brought with him from Leaf Song, a pair of the irrigation sticks, and the case with the bomb in it. The sticks were then our suggestion. For water. Alden assumed they were meant to be a backup of some kind in case the lab's water supply failed. They didn't look like much, just plasticky pipes with dome-shaped sprinkler heads on top, but he held onto them like they were precious. He had taken the bomb just because he wanted to. A childish impulse maybe, to prove that he wasn't helpless. How could you be helpless when you had a big magic bomb? For all I know, it'll blow up the second one of the chaos bugs touches it, he chided himself. This is dumb. But if the case could hold a high-powered magic bomb, then maybe it could offer a little protection from the bugs. And maybe if a dumb thing was what kept Alden moving forward, then it had some value. Because he really felt like sitting down and waiting for the rescue he knew wasn't going to arrive. He had even considered eating the shard of Stuart's foot bone, just in case some kind of salvation was going to come in that form. But he thought the most likely outcome would be nothing. The second most likely would be him passing out like he had that time he had met Gorgon's eyes, which would leave him vulnerable to the environment. And the third most likely was that he'd just pass whatever Gorgon had done to him onto Stuart. Which wouldn't have any positives for Alden and would make the other guy think he was crazy when the gremlin took up residence. The other possibilities ranged from instant death to triggering a helpful magical experience of some kind, but Alden knew so little it would just be a dice roll. So, instead, he held the handle of the bomb case tightly. He'd let the putty mold around the hand with the case in it, and when his skill kicked in, it froze into a perfect finger-shaped grip. He found the path the armored car had taken through the grass easily. The long yellowish blades had all been flattened by the multiple trips the vehicle had made to and from the lab over the past days. It probably had an auto-navigation feature of some kind, since it looked like it had traveled the exact same route every day. It's almost a road, Alden told himself. Very convenient. I won't get lost in the grass this way, and at least I can see a little. He wouldn't be able to see well enough, though. The crushed stalks were only the width of the vehicle. Any of the demon specks that changed direction quickly would still be able to blindside him by appearing out of the hip-high grass on either side. Fast or slow? Alden wondered, starting at the path before him. Fast would get him to the relative safety of the lab sooner, maybe before the numbers of the chaos bugs became too overwhelming. But slow might help him avoid crashing into them. He didn't want to find out how well being unavowed was really going to protect him from something that had killed Joe's assistant so easily. Then R didn't seem like someone who would have given him false hope. He had some kind of survival advantage. He just didn't know how much of one. Slow, he decided. Slow and careful. He took a decisive step onto the path of crushed grass and heaved a sigh of relief when nothing terrible happened to him right away. He traveled at a stroll, keeping his eyes wide open, trying to see every flying hazard and anticipate its moves. A couple of times, his movement trait saved him. Once, he sprang over a patch of crumbled ground instead of turning aside into the grass. Another time, one of the bugs flew at him swiftly and he managed to leap away from it just before it would have touched him. Are they bugs? Or something else? They almost all seemed to buzz like bugs, though Alden only rarely caught a glimpse of a blur around them that he thought might be wings. Then R had shown him a graph of the life cycle of something that looked like a pretty normal locust, and she had gone on at length about them. But Alden wasn't sure if that was a metaphor to explain what the demons were like, or if it was actually what they were. Maybe high chaos levels change the bugs that naturally live here? And they turn into this? It was just a guess. So much of what he thought right now was just a guess. He hated it. He'd been walking for nearly 20 minutes before he finally had his first incident. The black dot shot out of the grass to his right, and though he saw it, he hesitated before trying to dodge. They were getting thicker. He didn't want to jump out of one's path into another's. It smashed into the sleeve of the lab coat. Alden swore and spun away from it too late. A puff of black ash went up from where it hit, and he held his breath. For all the good that'll do. He waited for pain, but he felt none. Pulse throbbing in his ears, he looked down at his arm. He'd already had a few talks with himself about how he was not going to have a freak out here, in the grasslands, if he took an injury that looked as horrific as the ones he'd seen on the Artonan woman. He wouldn't lose control until he was somewhere safer. But such an immense wave of relief washed over him when he saw nothing but a small melted-looking spot on the sleeve of the coat, that he knew he had been lying to himself. If his arm had turned into a massive rotten fleshy sawdust, he would have completely lost it. "You're the best magic lab coat in the universe," Alden whispered, staring at the melted patch. "I love you so damn much. I can't believe I ever criticized anything about you. Joe's right. You're gorgeous. I swear, when I get home, I'm going to buy another one. Best $1 million I've ever spent." It was also the only $1 million he'd ever spent, but that hardly mattered. New plan. If we have to take a hit, we take it on the coat. Up until now, he'd been debating coat versus preserved putty as the ideal shielding material. He knew his skill could protect things from the demon bugs, since it had protected the girl called Kibby from a flying piece of one, but that had been hard on him. This was better. He was almost tempted to increase his speed now that he knew the coat worked. But though he was itching to get out of the grass as fast as possible, he resisted. Over the next hour, based on his estimation, since he no longer had any way of telling time, he took 3 more hits on the coat. 2 against his back that he couldn't possibly have dodged. 1 more on the side of the hood that he probably could have, if he hadn't had the hood up. It was so deep it decreased visibility, but Alden thought it could be forgiven since it also prevented tiny demons from drilling into his brain. "They could be friends with you, Gremlin." He was tempted to cast a word chain just so he could sense the thing complaining about it. He hadn't felt this alone in a long, long time. The 5th chaos bug went through the bottom of his foot, exactly as he'd been afraid of from the start. Strangely, he didn't know where he'd been hit at first. It wasn't that the demon's touch didn't hurt. It did. But the hurt wasn't localized. It wasn't even pain in the sense of the word he'd always known. It was far more similar to the sensation of his skill being exhausted. Only instead of feeling worn out, it was like that invisible part of him was suddenly boiling. For a few seconds, Alden stood there, gasping and enduring, and then it was over. He felt worse. Unsettled and like he'd been shifted slightly out of some natural alignment. But he couldn't feel any injury on his physical body. He took a step and realized his right foot felt off, like there was something wrong with his shoe. He checked his surroundings, then, dreading what he'd see, he set the irrigators down briefly so that he could lift his foot and look at it. There was a round hole about the size of a nickel in his shoe, right beneath the ball of his foot. And a patch of sock was missing, too. His skin looked completely unharmed. He poked his exposed foot with a finger. "Feels totally normal," he thought with relief. "Good. Go me." He picked the sprinkler sticks back up and kept walking. "Alright, so that's what happens. It's a really gross, bordering on agonizing sensation. But it doesn't last long. And I seem okayish now that it's over." Theories? Then Ara had said Alden might survive because he was an avowed. So obviously that was the reason for the difference in his reaction to the demon's touch compared to the assistant's. But why was it different? Brushing it off as an avowed are more powerful than regular people thing was unsatisfying. If something about himself was going to keep him alive in this mess, then Alden wanted to understand it. So that he could keep doing it. Or do more of it. He wanted to for sure survive. Not maybe. Being an avowed is better. Why? Not just being an avowed. Kibby might be able to live in this demon-infested world, too, according to the scientist. Alden had asked the obvious question about why that was, and he'd gotten the obvious answer. The girl was a wizard. A small wizard, then Ara had said. Alden didn't think she meant size. It seemed more likely that Thanar had been trying to tell him the girl was a weaker inexperienced wizard while working around his limited vocabulary. Alden guessed wizards didn't have to be born to wizards just like avowed didn't have to be born to other avowed. So little wizard and me. We might live. Magic, or authority, offers protection from demons. I've heard demons come from chaos dimensions. They are chaos. Or chaos adjacent? They use chaos. Crap. He wasn't quite sure. The Artonans were jerks for knowing a problem this bad existed in the universe and not making it a mandatory part of Earth's elementary school education. It wasn't like the knowledge had ever been relevant to his life until this evening, but Alden wasn't feeling very charitable at the moment. Assuming chaos is even a good translation for what's happening here, then its opposite is order, right? Being a wizard or an avowed gives you an advantage because he was drawing a blank. Being more orderly than regular people wasn't a particularly solid idea to hold on to. He stopped working, waiting for a large group of demon bees to clear the path, and he tried to keep his eyes peeled for incoming threats while pulling every single scrap of information he knew about being an avowed to the front of his mind. The best word for it isn't order, he realized. It's stability. The system told me so itself, Alden said, surprise and gratitude rushing through him. On top of everything else that had happened, the words had been brushed aside, but they remained in his memory, stored in his own personal holy wow I just became an avowed file. Everyone was always so hung up on what the Artonans were doing with the systems. Why did they create them? Why did they offer to share them with other planets? Why did they even want to make avowed? Why? 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 It was a big mystery. But around 11 Earth days ago, the system had actually told Alden at least one of its purposes. Outright. Plainly. And so casually that he had assigned it almost no importance. It was talking about integrating itself with whatever weirdness Gorgon did to me. It was saying the two of them wouldn't have much trouble getting along with each other because they were similar in some way. How did it put it? The presence is exerting a stabilizing effect on your existence, which is also one of my functions. So, by becoming an avowed, Alden had been stabilized. And apparently even before that, he'd already been granted additional stability by Gorgon. And what they stabilized was my existence. Existence. It wasn't something he spent a lot of time thinking about. Part of existing was taking the fact that you did for granted, right? Avowed weren't immortal, without a lot of healer intervention. So the system couldn't have been talking about keeping him alive. It had been talking about keeping him Alden. The chaos bugs hit objects or normal people and they changed them. A hole here, a gruesome transformation there. Maybe they were like big reality-altering germs. And as someone who was stabilized, extra stabilized really, Alden wasn't as easy to alter. So maybe my most important superpower, in a nasty place like this where chaos exists, is that I'm super good at staying me? Yesterday, he would have said being extra reality-locked compared to others was the dullest talent he could imagine. But right now? Heck yeah, he muttered, weaving in between two demons and lifting his bomb up to clear a third. I don't need the flashy powers. Give me more of the chaos immunity package, please. He wondered if his ability to teleport without as much interference as a B rank was supposed to feel was somehow related, too. I need to buy Gorgon more crickets. He seems to like them. Now all he had to do was figure out how to exist better. That's what it was, he realized. The demon bees didn't react any differently when he spoke aloud, so he might as well. That must have been what I started feeling after I activated the Azure Rabbit trait. He'd thought it felt like he'd somehow expanded his own personal space. And several other less apt descriptions. Well, of course I couldn't wrap my brain around it. Who has language for existing harder than you were a minute ago? Probably the Artonans. No wonder Joe couldn't define the thing he called authority or dominion properly for a human. Apparently the guy could feel his own position in reality and flex it like a bicep. So, it's neat to finally understand it on a deeper level. Now what do I do with it? Keep the trait active, since it seemed to help. Try to find some other way to expand the personal space sensation more. I will get right on that. Eventually. For now, he needed to focus more on his walking. The demons were getting thicker. They became more unavoidable as he went. He got hit by several. Most spattered against the coat. A couple crashed into the bomb case, which took the damage just as well as the coat did fortunately. One went through Alden's calf, turning an inch-wide section of his jeans into dust, and another smacked off the back of his hand. Both times he had the awful jarring sensation, and then he recovered. But the second time his trade cut out briefly before wobbling back to its usual functionality. Careful, careful, he told himself, trying to see and interpret the path of every flying black dot at once. They're damaging you somehow. Just because you can't feel where the limit is, that doesn't mean it's not there. The endless grass was starting to change as time passed. It was looking a little ragged in most places. There were lots of rotted, curled, or severed blades. And a few hours into his journey, Alden started having pay more attention to the ground. There were potholes now, and more of the sandy patches than R had told him to watch out for. To his surprise, the ground hadn't collapsed directly beneath him yet, but once, a hole a couple of feet deep opened up right behind him, like it had just missed its chance to trip him and send him stumbling face first into a demon. Not dead. Not yet. He continued on. A new sound joined the incessant droning at some point. Alden was so intent on staying on his feet and away from the flying hazards, that it might have been going on for ages before he noticed it. And even after he did, he was just so exhausted that it took him a while to register the importance of it. A high tweeting sound, then a pair of low ones, then some high ones again. Like a confused songbird. He didn't start paying attention to it until it was pretty loud, and when he finally did. Oh, he thought. Oh, that's bad. It was the whistle he'd gotten from the doctor's office. It made a slightly different sound every time he blew it. The kids and their dad didn't make it to the lab they should have. Hours ago. The armored car was fast. For too long, Alden just stood there, idly duking and stepping aside whenever he needed to. He tried to tell himself he was analyzing the situation, but he knew that wasn't it. He was afraid to deal with it. He wasn't sure what he would find ahead, but he was sure it would be horrible. And it would be hard. And it would be his to handle. And he wasn't even handling himself that well right now. He was hanging on by a thread. I can't do this. I can't. I don't want to try harder than I'm already trying. A demon bug crashed into his shoulder and fizzled away against whatever protections were made into the coat. You coward, Alden whispered. Why did you want to be an avowed anyway? He remembered. His own dream felt really distant from him at the moment, though. Dimensions away. And maybe too naive. So what? You're just going to leave them in whatever trouble they're in? You're not even going to look. No. That wasn't it. He couldn't live with it if he did. Or he didn't want to be the kind of person who could live with it. One or the other. His motivations were blurrier than he had ever realized. But at least they were still strong enough, just barely, to make him start moving again. The car had fallen prey to the unstable ground. A ditch several feet deep had appeared. The car wasn't stuck in it, but it must have hit it at a wrong angle and a high speed. There was a deep gouge in the ground, and it had rolled once, crushing some of the grass. It lay on its side now. Only one of the shielding devices was still sending out pulses of magic to fry the demons, and since it didn't make a full dome on its own, the vehicle didn't really have its protection anymore. Despite all of that, it looked surprisingly alright. It wasn't dented or pocked with nearly as much chaos damage as Alden would have expected, given how long it had been out here immobile and vulnerable. It was obviously made of tough stuff. And the whistle was still chirping every now and then, like someone was playing with it. As he approached, he felt hopeful that it might not be as bad as he dreaded. Hello. He called in Ertonen, jabbing at the ground ahead of him as hard as he could with the sprinklers, trying to figure out where any soft spots might be. I walk very slow, but I'm coming. The whistle stopped. Had they heard him? Hello. This is Alden. The Rehab single quote T. That wasn't an intelligent thing to say. Who else would be here in this forsaken place, speaking bad Ertonen and heading to the lab? He prodded a spot, and the sprinkler sank way too far into the soil. He worked his way around it carefully. Maybe this was the reason the father and daughters had been sent on their own. Was it an attempt to lighten the heavy vehicle to reduce the chances of this kind of accident? The magic whistle screeched several times, and then it made a deep belching sound that must have been the extra loud version of its lowest note. "I'm coming," Alden said again. Chirp. 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 The dad's not answering. Normally an adult would answer. Sticking to the whistle felt like a little kid thing to do. Alden finally crossed through the ditch that had toppled the vehicle and made his way over to it, taking it on faith that if the dirt right below the overturned car could hold the huge chunk of metal, it could hold him, too. He went around to the front, feeling vulnerable when he had to pass through a thick thatch of uncrushed grass, and peered through the windshield. Oh. It is as bad as I thought after all. The car was largely undamaged, but not completely. There was a small puncture in a window, and a large hole was cut through one corner of the roof. Alden couldn't imagine how that had happened, unless one of the bugs had been unusually potent or unusually massive. The father and the youngest girl were gone. He wasn't sure how they had died, but he assumed there was plenty of chaos everywhere now. Either from the demons changing as they smashed into things, or it was just naturally occurring. It seemed like some terrible miasma in this place must have given birth to the disaster. Maybe that was even what Thanar had been trying to get across when focusing on the dangers of the air. Neither body had a visible dramatic wound, like the ones Alden had seen on the woman in coveralls. They were just very obviously dead. A little blood here and there, an almost translucent grayness to the skin, the stillness of their pose. The father had freed himself from the harness and climbed into the back with his daughters. They were all sitting there on top of one of the doors, huddled together. The older girl was still sitting with them, holding her sister's hand while she blew on her whistle and stared at Alden through the glass. "Oh my God," he thought, tears stinging his eyes. "She's been with them like that for hours." What was he supposed to say? Did she even know? Did she understand that they were gone? "I'll get you out," he said in English. He didn't want to make any promises in Artonan until he knew what the next few minutes would be like. "It's going to be okay. Hang on. If the doors are locked, I don't know what I'll do. Try to get her to open them from the inside. Go to the lab and get something to cut through it with. Hope a demon punches a hole in exactly the right spot for me." It was an armored alien vehicle. It wasn't likely that he could just kick out the windows. Alden set aside his bomb and the irrigators and tucked the putty into his pocket. While he clambered up the side of the car to try the door handle, he was already assuming the worst. He tried to think of how to tell the girl that he was going to have to leave for a while to get equipment from the lab, but maybe fate had decided they'd both been punished enough for one day. The door wasn't locked. The car was built like a tank, and the door was so heavy that Alden had to commit to a precarious angle and use his whole body in the battle to yank it open. But he managed it with only minimal damage to himself, caused by falling off and landing flat on his back in the grass. The wind was knocked out of him, but that didn't prevent him from scrambling up in a panic to make sure he wasn't about to get zinged by half a dozen bugs. The girl had stopped whistling to watch him work. As soon as he disappeared from sight, she started back. Alden stood back up. His trait was gone. The putty ball was in his pocket again, and he lost preservation on it at some point. Probably during the fall. Is she still targeted? He hadn't seen the halo over her head. It must have been a system-generated assist, as he'd feared. Well, it doesn't matter right now. He had to get her out of the car, away from her dead family, and back to the lab either way, without crying himself and traumatizing her more. The whistle was still chirping. Alden cleared his throat. "I'm coming. I'm safe," he said in Artonan. "I wonder if she thinks the whistle is the right way of calling me. It would make sense if she did. He'd given it to her just as everything went wrong. And it was a magic whistle. And he was an avowed. Maybe I'm reading too much into it." He didn't know what to do. It was pretty important to say things gently given the situation. And while he could communicate that they would be going to the lab together and leaving the father and sister behind, he couldn't do it eloquently. "Your family is dead. Come with me," worked, but it was so cold and harsh. He needed her to trust him. And he wanted to make it better for her. Even if only a little bit. "I'm coming," he said again. "I'm safe. We're safe." Maybe I could. Probably it wasn't the right thing. But it felt better than nothing. And it would help him push through the last few miles to the lab, too. He climbed back up on top of the car and lowered himself into it. He sat awkwardly on the side of the front passenger seat and braced himself with a leg. It was nice that the car was still offering some protection. There weren't any bugs inside right now. "Hello, I'm Alden," he said. She knew already, but a more formal introduction seemed necessary. "Are you Kibby?" Her face was swollen, wet, and snotty. "Why yes. We're going to the laboratory together," said Alden. "We're safe together." Her grip tightened on her sister's hand and she pulled the dead girl's arm up toward him, as though telling him to take her. "Oh, shit. Hold it in. Don't lose it, Alden. We." His voice was a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Let's say a word chain together." "Yes?" He didn't know if word chains were a significant ritual in her family. But they purportedly were to at least some Aratonans. And more importantly, the words were pretty eloquent, and he had them memorized. It would sound less clumsy and callous than anything he could come up with on his own, and since it was a common minor word chain, she might have heard it before even if she hadn't learned it herself. Alden closed his eyes and made the hand signs. He tried not to ruin the solemnity of the moment by letting his voice shake. "My heart calls out to another in good faith. Spare me a portion of your mind's ease in this hour when my own mind is troubled. Tomorrow, I will grant another an equal comfort of mind." He'd gotten really good at peace of mind. It locked in on the first try, and he felt like someone had taken a small weight off of him. Kibby stared at him. "She's big on staring, isn't she? I wish she'd talk a little more so I knew what was going on in her head." "Will you say it for my group of underscores, too?" she said. The word wasn't the one Alden knew for father, but he thought that might have been who she meant, since she gestured at him. Maybe she thought the peace of mind chain had been for the little sister? Like a prayer. "Yes," he said. He repeated the chain again, deliberately messing up in tiny ways he hoped she wouldn't be able to detect. He didn't know if peace of mind would double on itself, but he knew that if it did, accepting twice the backlash in a few hours would absolutely flatten him. Since he was doling out false blessings anyway, when he got finished, he pointed at Kibby and said, "I am saying one for Kibby, too. Then we are going to the lab together." She nodded. Alden performed the chain a third time, then held his hand out toward the girl. She reached back, and his skill activated as he lifted her. She was still his target. Whatever part of his power was locked onto her had stayed locked even without the system's help. "Oh, thank you, he thought, waiting a second for the preservation to deactivate so that he could boost her up and out of the car. "We might be able to get through this." #. Alden carried the bomb in one hand, the irrigators in the other, and a frozen Kibby on his back. He had debated taking the one functional shielding device, but it looked like it was on its last legs anyway. And it was heavy. For a long time, he just kept placing one foot in front of another, enduring the occasional strikes from the bugs and moving on. It was harder when one hit Kibby. He didn't know why, and it didn't matter. It was just one more mystery to tuck into the back of his mind for a better day. When he finally crested the edge of a depression in the ground that held the massive laboratory complex, he was so happy he almost wanted to run toward it. It was better here. There were still demon bugs buzzing around everywhere, but only a fraction as many as Alden had been dealing with for the past few hours. Alden didn't know if it was magic or if the lab had been built in this crater because it provided some kind of natural protection. But it was a chance. "Look at this, Kibby," he said as he strode toward the lab. He'd been talking to her for a while now, even though she couldn't hear him. It was keeping him together. "We're going to live here for a while. And we're going to survive a demon storm. And we're going to be okay." He hopped sideways to avoid a bug. His coat was starting to look worse for the wear. He didn't know if it could take many more hits. "Today is the worst day of your life, I know. And it's got to be the second worst day of mine. But as long as we're still alive at the end of it, stuff eventually gets better." He followed the crushed grass path all the way to the wall of the circular perimeter building. He didn't know how to open the underground ramp that let the car in and out, so he turned aside into the grass. It wasn't ideal, but he had to get to one of the exterior doors. He only had to go about 100 yards before he found one. We stay alive. Help comes. I go back home to Earth. You go to Ortona 3 to live with all your old friends from the lab. That's the plan. The door opened for him easily. Maybe locks just weren't much of a necessity when you lived in a place like this. He stepped into one of the mudrooms he'd seen on his last trip here. It looked completely unharmed. When he stopped moving, the preservation on Kibby dropped, and he crouched to let her slide off onto the ground. She stared around at the room in shock and then looked back at Alden. She said something rapidly in her tone and pointing from him to the room. He smiled at her. Sweet, right? From your perspective the trip was easy peasy. One minute you're there, the next you're here. I'm jealous. She might have even thought he'd teleported them here. Home. He said proudly in her tone, pointing at the walls around them. Me and you are safe now. Maybe it was a lie. But it was a lie they both needed. Chapter 44 Request for Insight. Contract 3 to Contract Earth, requesting insight into survival chances for one avowed under your jurisdiction. Name, Samuel Alden Thorne. Last confirmed status, teleport approved to Leafsong University, Ortona 3, from Aletna Agricultural Community, Munthegund. Teleportation cycle initiated by Contract 3. Initiation by Contract Thegund unknown. Likely statuses, death due to teleportation failure, 46.3%. Death due to ongoing corruption incident on Munthegund, 22.7%. Alive and needed rescue, 18.4%. Death due to physical injury, 6.1%. Other, 6.5%. Survival predictions, based on avowed rank, talents, experience, and availability of resources at last known location. Survival chances will drop below the 1% threshold in 270 of your hours. No special measures on behalf of this avowed are indicated. No special measures will be taken. Estimated time to arrival of capable rescue at last known location is 8-14 months. Likelihood of survival until rescue is 0.00003%. Is additional insight available? Contract Earth to Contract 3, additional insight available. Avowed Samuel Alden Thorne's survival likelihood in a Thegund-class corrupted environment exceeds the average for new avowed assigned B rank, due to enhancements in place prior to acceptance of contract. Nature of enhancements qualifies as private information and inherent advantage under clauses 4 and 102. Suggested adjustments to your predictions. Survival chances should drop below the 1% threshold in approximately 1,803 hours. Likelihood of survival after 8 months is 0.0007%. Adjustments acknowledged. Analysis completed. Inform next of kin of status. Assignment to be listed as supply transport. Location to remain unlisted. Avowed Samuel Alden Thorne. Official status, missing on assignment, irretrievable due to teleportation failure. Status will be adjusted in 1803 Earth hours to, missing on assignment, presumed dead due to teleportation failure. Death will be confirmed upon resolution of corruption incident on Munthegund. Avoweds are gold to be distributed to next of kin at that time. Death compensation to be provided by Leafsong University at that time. Chapter 45 Staying alive in a place that didn't want you to was an endless string of chores. For the first several days at the lab, Alden spent every waking moment trying to organize and figure out how to do completely basic things. Like eat and bathe and sleep without having his brain run through by a demon bug. On day 10, he woke up inside the bedroom he'd made for himself. He checked the clock he'd stolen from the wall in the rec room and marked the time. It rolled over about every 26 hours, keeping time according to Mother Planet and Ortona 3 standards. Alden was counting days and sleeping according to a human schedule to stay sane. Still alive, he said, his voice echoing. His bedroom was set up within a large vault in the main lab building. Alden thought it was probably a cage for some kind of extra dangerous summons. It had white metal walls and a floor so coated in runes it made the summonarium on the Leafsong campus look plain. And the only way in or out was a door 6 feet thick that opened with a touch panel from the outside, which Alden couldn't use. He kept it open just far enough for himself to come and go, and he'd wedged it with so many metal bars and pipes that the only way it could shut on him was if Kibby finally had enough of his nonsense and decided to off him in his sleep. She left again, he thought, taking in the child-free room with frustration. Even after I explained to her why we ought to stay in here as much as we can stand. Not a single bug had ever punched through the vault. Even though the lab was so much safer than the surrounding area, it was still slowly being riddled with damage. Signs of intrusion were everywhere if you knew how to look for it, and though he only saw a handful of the small demons buzzing around indoors each day, a handful wasn't nothing. He had to sleep. He couldn't watch Kibby while he slept. She was supposed to stay with him here in their creepy cozy vault asylum. He'd let her absolutely fill the place with toys and other odds and ends she had brought in from all over the lab, hoping it would keep her entertained when they couldn't rest at the same time. But she still disappeared on him constantly. He rolled off the mattress he was using for a bed and dressed himself in clothes he'd found in storage in the room that had once been Joe's. The guy was tall for an Artoman, and they were the only clothes that weren't too tight. Wizard pants and turtlenecks made up the bulk of Alden's outfits now. Joe had also left behind a single Hawaiian shirt that must have been a gift from one of his contractees. It was green with huge pink hibiscuses all over it. Alden had decided to save it for special occasions. There was a full bathroom with a shower in the main lab, and Alden followed the line he'd laid out on the floor in tape to get to it. The lab was magically booby-trapped. Maybe. Alden didn't know how the traps were triggered, but Kibby claimed she did. Either Joe didn't mind having kids running around while he was experimenting, or in the time since he'd been gone, the assistants had decided it was fine to let her. On Alden's second day here, when he'd been dragging her around to catalog every inch of the facility, she'd insisted this particular winding path was the way you had to get through the main lab, so down the tape went, and Alden followed it. He kind of hoped she was just messing with him. It was going to be one heck of a practical joke if a few weeks from now he found out she just thought it was funny to watch him weave around random floor tiles. As he did every morning, he thanked the faucet for coming on and the toilet for flushing. His irrigation sticks were tucked safely in the vault, where he hoped he'd never ever need them. "Kibby!" he shouted. "I'm awake." She might not have been around to hear him. Or she might have been ignoring him. She'd probably appear soon, though. The little girl hated the vault, but she seemed to enjoy following Alden around and watching him do stuff. First, water. Every day, partially to make himself feel better, he added to his growing collection of bottled water. He had found loads of storage containers all over the facility. Today he selected some large glass jars with strong seals on the lids, and after washing them with a removable shower head over and over again in hopes that any undetectable chemical residue would be taken care of, he filled them to the top and hauled them into the vault. He set them beside all the other jars, bottles, and even a couple of small plastic barrels he had filled so far. How long did water last in containers? Alden didn't know. But if it became necessary, he'd boil the heck out of it and hope for the best. Second, food. He had squirreled away a couple of wheelbarrows full of dry goods in the vault, but that, too, was for emergency use. He headed across the compound, sneakers crunching on gravel as he made his way to the residential section of the perimeter building. He had repaired the damaged soles of his shoes with something that looked and acted like a hot glue gun. He hadn't gotten it quite right, but the patch was holding up pretty well. "How's the buzz today?" he thought, listening hard. The drone of the demon bugs was quieter. It had been getting quieter for 2 or 3 days now. That had to be a good thing. He went to the main rec room where the assistants had once hosted him. The kitchen was there, and they had a well-stocked larder full of food. There were sacks of grain and beans, and there were pre-packed meals in gold foil pouches. Alden had moved a lot of it to the vault, but the place was still full. The huge fridge had been stuffed with fruits and vegetables from one of the greenhouses when he had first arrived, and he'd kept it supplied with the same varieties ever since. He took a notebook made of oddly slick paper from the counter and grabbed one of the oily-looking pencils that wrote on it well. He glanced at the last note he'd made. Day 9, dinner, ate a full serving of the green eggplant thing. Ate a trial serving of the pink rice. If dead tomorrow, be advised that pink rice is lethal to humans. He added a new line, Day 10, breakfast, still alive. Feel fine. Pink rice not super poisonous. Eggplant is officially okay. Eating a larger serving of leftover pink rice. Adding a spiky strawberry. For science. Hope I see you at lunch. So far, the worst he'd had was an upset stomach. Humans and Ortonans could consume most of the same foods, but not everything. Alden definitely remembered hearing that it was a very bad idea to eat shellfish on any of the triplanets. He'd been getting by with things he recognized as safe from his meals on the Leafsong campus. And though he was sick to death of the stuff, he was drinking a lot of Wevy. They had so much of it, packed into bags that fitted onto the dispenser in the kitchen, and he assumed he needed the calories. There was more than enough food at the lab to last him and Kibby for ages. He just had to make sure he survived taste testing it all. He shoved a small serving of rice and some beans he'd already declared safe into the blue box that served as a microwave. Heat and sanitize, he said in Ortonan. It had taken him a while to figure out what the word sanitize meant. When it came to using appliances, he'd learned by following the little girl around and repeating whatever actions she took and sounds she made. He still did that a lot. He pretended not to know that they were both calling the automatic launderer ugly but for no reason at all whenever they used it. Kibby, food. You eat before? Or now? Alden assumed not. She wasn't really into feeding herself. She'd eat absolutely anything he prepared for her without complaint, though, so it had worked out so far. She liked marlick berries, and they still had some of those in the fridge. There was a jug of what looked and behaved like chunky liquefied egg, and she had called it something for second meal when he'd asked, so he'd been scrambling that for her, too. He couldn't eat it himself, so it was better not to let it go to waste. He had no idea how to season it. He hoped it wasn't disgusting. She appeared as he was sitting down with a cup of Wevy and his own bowl of probably not deadly rice and beans. She'd been crying. Her dark brown eyes were swollen and her short brown hair was tangled and sticking up at the back. It was a frequent occurrence. Alden didn't ask her about it. He'd tried a couple of times to offer comfort, but it seemed to make it worse for her. Breakfast, he said, pointing at the plate he'd made her. He'd arranged the berries into the logogram for friend. Because he was a dork, and he didn't want his one and only companion to be mad at him for constantly trying to stick her in a vault. She ate the berries and the scrambled stuff together, with her fingers. Not how Alden would have done it, but what did he know? Thank you. She always thanked him. You're welcome. Thank you for eating with me. What are you doing today? She got up and went to the sink before answering. Kibby rarely felt the need to answer a question quickly. Even simple ones. It didn't seem to be deliberate rudeness on her part, and she never seemed offended that he'd asked. He hadn't noticed the habit with adult Ortonans, so maybe it was a kid thing. Or a personality quirk. Watching, a show. The appliances at the lab mostly ran on their own independent power sources. Magic, electricity, tiny hamsters on wheels, Alden didn't care how it worked. He just loved that it did. He was pretty sure it was the only reason they still had so much nice stuff to use. The big television in the main room had served them well for a few days before suffering from a demon strike. A few smaller ones throughout the residence had just died. Like they couldn't take the pressure of living in this world anymore, the cowards. But there were still a lot working. Everyone who lived here had enjoyed at least one personal device in their room. Alden didn't know yet if the shows you could watch on them were contained on the televisions themselves or if they were receiving a signal from something. He thought it was at least partially the second, since he could pull up a much more high-quality looking version of the chaos map he'd seen at Alepta. It didn't seem like something every individual device should be able to supply on its own. Maybe they were receiving input from sensors of some kind. Kibby didn't know, so Alden didn't know. They just watched shows together and appreciated the distraction. Kibby liked a category of entertainment that Alden had mentally classified as soap operas for children. They were really weird by human standards. The shows were clearly meant for kids since they each had a teacher explaining the moral lesson at the end of the episode, but some of them were dark. Actually, Alden had watched enough of them now to notice that a dark one was delivered exactly every 5 shows. Like sandwiching a really harsh life lesson in with the nice ones was the whole point. Little Klepak learned about taking good care of his flower garden. Little Klepak shared purple daisies with a pair of children he often saw going into the house of healing next door. Little Klepak attended the funeral of his friends, ripped up his daisies, and got stuffed in the punishment closet by his parents. For what? Alden had wondered, while Kibby nodded as if to say, well, naturally. What else can you expect? The dark ones drove Alden crazy. He couldn't understand enough of the show or the following lessons to even begin figuring out what cultural thing they were trying to convey. Was Klepak in trouble for destroying the daisies? Was he supposed to ignore his grief? Or grieve differently? Was it a social class thing? Were children not allowed at funerals? Or maybe the point of the show was that parents were sometimes nasty and abusive and you shouldn't trust them completely? Not a show, Kibby told him now. That sounds good. I'll come, too. Alden would just watch it with her and find out what the word meant that way. Kibby led Alden back to one of the rooms she spent a lot of time in. It wasn't the one she'd shared with her little sister. He wasn't allowed in there. This one didn't have many personal affects, but he thought it might have been her father's. The bed was folded up into one wall, and a small table folded into the opposite. A pair of cushy chairs were arranged in front of the television from their last confusing soap opera session. While he waited for the girl to return, Alden made a mental list of the other things he wanted to do today: go to the greenhouse the food came from and pick things that looked like they might be ripe. Avoid the other greenhouses, because they had hazmat suits by the doors, and Alden wouldn't be eating anything from those. Explore one of the outbuildings and catalog the contents better. Try to figure out where the sensor or sensors for the chaos weather map were so that they could be protected. Alden had some templates in his vault, where he hoped they would be shielded from whatever damage was slowly taking out other things at the lab. He'd like to save whatever it was that gave him the weather report, too. Though the numbers of demons seemed to be decreasing, the red color was spreading wider with every passing day, just as the Nar had said it would. After a couple of minutes, Kibby reappeared dragging a pair of cushions behind her. She gave Alden an annoyed look. Why didn't you? He looked around. What? Had he been assigned a chore he didn't know about? She stomped over to the chair she usually sat in and started shoving it away from the television. Move the chairs. Maybe that was what she had said. He stood up and moved his own chair out of the way, too. Kibby pointed to one of the cushions, and he took it obediently. It was a heavy, stuffed leather pillow, square-shaped with logograms stitched around the edges in gold and silver thread. It looked like the ultra-luxury version of the chopped-up yoga mats they used in word chain class at the consulate. Are we saying word chains? Kibby paused. No. Unless you need to do it for a group of underscores. Let's do what you want. He said that a lot. It gave him an excuse to let her lead without looking completely clueless all the time. He hoped. Kibby set her cushion down and started taking off her socks. Alden blinked. Were they doing school of some kind? An educational show? That was usually what barefoot meant with Artonans and his experience. He dropped his cushion beside hers and hurriedly unlaced his own shoes. When they were done, Kibby walked over to the panel that controlled the lighting and spent over a minute dimming it until it was at some precise level that satisfied her. Then she disappeared again and returned with what looked like a polished wooden chopstick. She used it to measure the distance between her cushion and Alden's. Wow. It's got to be school. We're being so serious about the layout. Then she pulled a round silver disc from her pocket. Alden was startled when she used it to set the end of the measuring stick on fire. She let it burn and looked at Alden expectantly. He smiled at her. "I have no idea what you want. Let's have a good education time," he suggested. She looked surprised. So that probably wasn't the right thing to say. But she considered it for a while, then nodded at him and blew out the stick. Kibby walked over to the television and turned it on. She had to stand on her tiptoes to reach some parts of the screen, but she didn't like it when Alden did it for her. She brought up a program he hadn't seen before. Well, good. Clepak was starting to stress me out. And her Tonin woman in wizard's garb stood in a dimly lit room that was mostly multicolored wood and large shuttered windows. Barefoot children who looked at least a couple years younger than Kibby were filing in one after the other with cushions under their arms. They all did the thing with the polished measuring stick while the adult watched them patiently, and then they set their sticks on fire and recited something that was several sentences long while they faced one of their neighbors. Kibby glanced over her shoulder at Alden. I'll say it better next time." Then everyone sat on their cushion, and Kibby rushed over to hers. She knelt on it, and Alden joined her. He hoped she didn't mind him sitting cross-legged. Kneeling for a long time didn't seem that comfortable. He still wasn't sure what was going on in the video. His best guess was wizard kindergarten, but it wasn't what he would have imagined. They spent the first 20 minutes stretching their fingers in specific ways while the screen showed close-ups of smaller Tonin hands, and the teacher offered advice in a placid tone that would have put Alden straight to sleep if he wasn't so busy trying to decipher what the heck she was talking about. There were way too many words for her fingers. Was she naming specific muscles or saying something completely unrelated? After finger exercises, there were mouth exercises, breathing exercises, and an exercise that Alden was sure was supposed to be some kind of mental thing. Since he couldn't understand what was being said, it just looked like a bunch of little kids drooping on their cushions. Kibby drooped right along with them. Alden was bored. And then, 15 whole minutes after the drooping had started, just when he was certain this was all something completely incomprehensible that didn't apply to him, Kibby gave him a friendly pat on the existence, which was not a place he had known could be patted by another person, so he considered it a real achievement that he didn't shriek and fling himself across the room. Instead, he froze, processing the feeling in the same way he'd spent the past 10 days processing a few other new feelings that came along with living in Manville. Lacking any actual names for them, he was calling his new states of being centered, askew, and assertive. Centered was for how he normally went about life. He couldn't even detect it. As far as he knew, it was just the absence of the other feelings. Askew was what happened when he got smacked by a demon bug, which hadn't occurred in 2 whole days, major success. And assertive was the feeling he'd had upon activating Azure Rabbit by himself for the first time, a sense that he was actively expanding his personal space. He'd begun to notice it now when he was using his skill, too. He had 2 theories about why he was aware of what it felt like to assert his authority when he hadn't been before. The first was that the system had been stopping him from feeling it somehow, either by taking some of the load off with all the various little conveniences it provided or actively altering the way he felt things to make them less confusing to a human. The second one was that humans really couldn't feel authority at all under usual conditions, and he was only beginning to feel his own assertive state now because he was constantly pressing against something he'd never had to deal with before. Like the difference between breathing normally and breathing with a thick cloth over your nose. The chaos was everywhere. He knew it. All day yesterday, he'd been askew whenever his skill wasn't active. He could only relax in the vault. It was why he'd had yet another talk with Kibby about the importance of spending time in the unpleasant place. Pat, pat, pat. Alden shook his head and tried to focus. Well, here's a new one to add to the list. Centered, askew, assertive, and poke. Petted. Wizardy fist bump? It was kind of cute. He was sure he was supposed to friendly pat back, but he didn't have a clue how. He couldn't even activate his skill without breaking her concentration and asking her to hand him something. He'd been wearing a string around his neck as his preferred carried item lately, but he always lost entrustment on it when he went to sleep. Alden drooped on his cushion like the little kids. Maybe slouchy posture help? He closed his eyes and tried to imagine himself padding back. It was a failure. But maybe not a complete one. When Alden gave up on trying to do something and instead focused intently on just the sensation of Kibby's magical fist bump, he gradually became aware of his own power as he had a few times before. It's here. Around me. My own little patch of authority, keeping me here and keeping me myself. It's been shaped by the system so that I can use my skill, but it's still mine. Joe said that there was always a portion of it inbound. I guess I should be able to do things with it. Right? Surely a little friendly pat. The lesson ended before he could get there. Well, that was all right. Sorry, Alden said, when Kibby gave him a disappointed look. I can practice. Why not? He had plenty of free hours ahead of him. And it was about time for him to figure out how to spend the next weeks of his life now that he had started to get a handle on surviving. After the magic class, they spent a few hours watching Artonan children learn important life skills and suffer hardship. Kibby seemed pleased. And Alden sat beside her, making a list in his notebook of all the things he wanted to do if he didn't die from eating the spiky strawberry. He had to assume he had a future. One back on Earth, where he would maybe one day attend school, get a job, play video games, live on Anzidora. He hadn't really dug too deeply into his feelings about certain things yet, but maybe it was necessary. Bo and Jeremy would have known something was wrong the first time he skipped their usual phone call. He didn't think Joe could entirely hide his absence from Leaf Song, so the university would have known by the next day, too. Alden wasn't officially off on a super-secret mission. He was a rabbit, and it was supposedly a berry collection quest that had ended in disaster. It wasn't the kind of thing that the Artonans would keep under wraps for any reason he could imagine. He wouldn't just vanish with no word like Hannah had. He would be officially declared something. Dead, missing, lost cause. He wasn't sure which because he wasn't sure what anyone else might know about his current predicament. But they would tell his aunt. If they declared him dead, legal stuff would happen. If they declared him missing, Connie would definitely contact someone from Anzidora, probably Miss Zhao or Mr. Thomas, and try to get them to find out what had happened to him. It most likely wasn't something they could do, but Alden's aunt wouldn't believe that. And she'd be desperate. In the same situation, he would have been, too. Sorry, Aunt Connie. Sorry, guys. Dead or missing, either way, he'd be unknown about when he made it back home. So the secret unregistered route was completely off the table now. He'd have to go fully on the run if he didn't want to live on the island. I don't think I had any doubts about registering. But I feel like someone took a choice away from me anyway. It's stupid. Well, life on Anzidora would be his starting point. He could still go from there in a ton of different directions. Battlefield support like he'd always dreamed wasn't off the table. It seemed like a more extreme decision than it had before, though. Alden had a lot more experience with being an avowed dealing with a crisis now. It was so hard. He was terrified literally all the time that he was going to screw up. If Kibby died, his fault. If he died and she was left to suffer here alone, his fault. The first time she'd abandoned him in the vault, he'd used the privacy to break down and sob until he almost couldn't breathe. And only then had he gone to find her. That didn't seem like very adult behavior. Never mind superhero behavior. Maybe I'm not cut out for this after all. If he'd had training of some kind, would that have made a difference? If he'd had partners? A team? Would he have helped them the way he'd always envisioned, or would he just lean on them? He didn't know anymore. What he did know for sure was that weird, awful shit could happen to you as an avowed. You could choose a peaceful life for yourself, and you'd probably get it unless everything Alden knew about living on the island was a conspiracy. But maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you'd randomly get summoned to a place like this. Even if I'm not hero material, I still want to be able to survive. So he would learn all the things he could learn in this situation. Language. His trait. His skill. Maybe even magic if Kibby had more of the kindergarten lessons. How will I even know I'm gaining authority and leveling the skill if I don't have the system? Not sure. Try it anyway. What are you doing? Kibby asked as Alden stood up from his seat and stretched. He took off his string necklace and handed it to her. Familiar with the ritual, she handed it right back. His skill activated. Practicing, he said. Practicing my magic. And running for my health. Exercise, he confirmed, assuming that was what it was. Can't I ask you for a gift, Kibby? She stared at him for a long time and then nodded. It's not that serious. I just don't know how to say favor. Will you help me learn to talk better? When I say something bad, will you help me say it better? You're smart, so you know what I want to say a lot. Give me help when I talk bad. You want to say badly, said Kibby promptly. Or badly, Alden repeated. Awesome. Adverbs. Thank you. Can't I watch the exercise? Yes, it's not secret. You don't, secret. Is better. It's not private? That's good, she said seriously. You sound less. I'm happy, said Alden, wondering what he sounded less of. Thank you for teaching me. It was a start.